Resuming debate, please do débat. The honourable member for Dartmouth, Cole Harbour.
I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to stand and speak for a few moments on Bill C-5, an act to amend the Canada-Newfoundland Atlantic Accord Implementation Act, the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and other acts, and to provide for certain other measures. This is a piece of legislation that has been as a result that exists as a result of negotiations that have been going on for literally 12 years now between the federal government and Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia. It mirrors legislation that has already been passed in both of those provincial legislatures, Mr. Speaker. So we won't be amending it here. If so, of course, that means that they all will then have to go back to the drawing board. And I want to say that that this bill is an attempt to strengthen offshore health and safety practices in the oil and gas industry, which have been separated and left to regulations. And that's a problem that I've certainly seen with other legislation in my former jurisdiction, Nova Scotia. The government for 20 years did the same thing with the Trade Union Act on the one hand and with health and safety legislation on the other. What we found out, certainly in the case of health and safety legislation, was it wasn't good enough to do it all by regulations, that you had to make sure that the rules of the road were properly articulated, the principles were properly articulated in legislation, and then the regulations would be there to make sure that those principles are carried forward. It's good to see that the governments involved here, the three governments, see that this is important to have done, and so we will be supporting the bill at second reading. This bill will put a practice into legislation, as I said. It's based on three basic principles. Number one, offshore occupation health and safety laws must provide workers with protection at least as good as those that exist for onshore workers, a situation that has existed for far too many years, Mr. Speaker, and that is finally being addressed here. The protection of employees. Number two, the protection of employee rights, that is to know, to participate, to refuse, to be protected from reprisal, will be covered in this bill. And finally, support for an occupational health and safety culture that recognizes the shared responsibilities in the workplace. Now, as I say, this is a piece of legislation that we support. We think it is a step in the right direction for offshore safety, but more work still needs to be done, Mr. Speaker, and we hope that the federal government continues to work with the provinces to strengthen offshore safety regulations, and that an independent standalone safety regulator is created for the future. That last point is something that came out of the Wells Commission, Mr. Speaker, that recommended that a standalone regulator be put in place, and it was something that was not agreed to by the parties and therefore does not exist. We think it's very important, and I'm going to speak a little more about that here this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, as usual, a bill like this comes to the floor of a legislature as a result of hard lessons, and in this case, lessons learned from years of offshore tragedies. It's been more than 30 years since Canada's worst offshore disaster in 1982. 84 people were killed when the drill rig Ocean Ranger sank off of Newfoundland. As I indicated, a Royal Commission was subsequently convened in 1984, and that commission criticized the industry for poor safety training, equipment, and lax inspections. I want to take a moment to read a section from a book that was written by a good friend of mine, someone who lost her brother in that disaster. back in 1982. Susan Dodd wrote an exceptional piece of work called The Ocean Ranger, Remaking the Promise of Oil, that talks very much about not only that disaster, what led to it and what resulted from it, the devastation that it caused to the families involved, but it very much documents the problems that resulted as a consequence of legislatures not paying attention. As a result, frankly, of the power of the oil and gas sector to basically have their way and go about their business, and governments said, "Thank you very much. We'll take some royalty revenue from you, but we'll try not to get in your way." And I want to read, if I may, a passage from this book, which I think underlines why it's so important that we not only pay attention to this bill, but we also think about the role that we play here as legislators to make sure that we do everything in our power to provide the laws, the regulations, the rules of the road, the protections that ensures that people living and working in this country and for this country are safe, Mr. Speaker. So let me go on and quote. "The shock of the Ocean Ranger disaster was not that oil production was dangerous, but rather the realization that governments had betrayed people's faith. People trusted governments to use reasonable regulation to mitigate the risk of oil jobs. That trust was misplaced. There were no provincial safety regulations in the Newfoundland offshore when my brother and his 83 co-workers died. Time and again, publics trust governments to ensure the companies operate with reasonable prudence. Time and again, we are shocked by a new disaster caused by corporate negligence." We will say, and we do it all the time in this House, we say that we will never forget, then we forget. And then it happens again. As the author, she goes on to talk about the fact that the most recent example is in 2010 when the Deepwater Horizon disaster killed 11 workers, injuring 17 more, resulting in the worst U.S. marine oil spill in history. Mr. Speaker, it's a fascinating book. I urge all members, anyone interested in taking a look at it. Again, it's The Ocean Ranger, Remaking the Promise of Oil. The author is Susan Dodd. It's particularly important for those of us living on the coast. In my case, living on the East Coast, we know that some of the big oil companies, that Shell has invested over $1 billion to further explore an oil field off our coast. Also, BP in another area offshore is further investing nearly $1 billion in exploring a similar development. In other words, Mr. Speaker, we can't pretend that it's not coming again, that we're not going to be out there again. There are rigs out there off of Newfoundland. We know that there are drilling rigs and exploratory rigs out there. There's equipment moving around our coast, and we need to make sure that the people that are working in our offshore, the people that are servicing the offshore, are provided with the necessary protections to make sure that these kind of disasters don't happen again. And important that we do that now. I should say, of course, that the our more recent review of offshore safety came in 2009 after the crash of Cougar Flight 91, which killed 17 people. Mr. Speaker, the Wells inquiry into the Cougar flight crash made a number of recommendations. most notably the creation of the autonomous and dedicated safety regulator, which is not included. My colleague, the member from St. John's East, raised a question in the House today, speaking about one of the recommendations that has gone before transport to ensure that for airplanes, helicopters, that they be allowed to run, or they be able to operate an hour after they no longer have any oil, or they run dry, as an important safety measure that would have, in fact, ensured that the disaster I referred to of Cougar Flight 91 would not have happened. We continue to ask this government questions. Why is it that they are unwilling to introduce that particular requirement of the offshore? So while I am disappointed, as others on the side have said, that this bill does not call for an independent safety regulator, I do believe that it's a step in the right direction. Again, it implements many of the principles of occupational health and safety. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, offshore occupational health laws must provide workers with protection at least as good as those which exist for onshore workers. The protection of employee rights, that is, to know, to participate, to refuse, and to be protected from reprisals, be included. And that's an issue has been raised in this session of the House with Bill C-2. Bill C-2, as it relates to, no, it's not Bill 2, it's the Omnibus Budget Bill. Is that C-4? What? C-4. The Omnibus Budget Bill. In there, there are changes which lessen the responsibilities of health and safety inspectors. And we are concerned about the implications those changes will have on Bill C-5. Because, as I say, in this bill, it talks about setting up a balance between health and safety protections onshore and offshore, that it provides the clear protection of the rights of employees to know, to participate, to refuse, and to be protected from reprisal. But we're concerned that in the Omnibus Budget Bill, it in fact lessens those rights in federal jurisdictions, and therefore may have some implication here. I understand in a recent briefing on this bill, we were unable to get answers to those particular questions, Mr. Speaker, but we will continue to do so. And the final thing is support for an occupational health and safety culture that recognizes the shared responsibilities in the workplace. As I've suggested to you, Mr. Speaker, and to other members, we will continue to see further exploration, further development of natural resources off our coasts. We need to make sure that we provide the environmental protections that are necessary if we are going to go forward, to ensure that number one, no problems exist, or no problems are created, nothing happens that endangers our natural resources, our coastline, our industries, fishery, our environment, Mr. Speaker, marine life, the oceans. It's an issue, of course, that's come up on the East Coast and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we know, Mr. Speaker, the issue around the development of Old Harry, the Old Harry site, is a controversial one. It's a controversial one for reasons like this, to make sure that we have protections in place for the people that work on any particular drill site, but that we make sure that the environmental protections are in place before any company is allowed to go forward to proceed with any development. Because You know, in the Gulf, as you have probably heard in this House, if there is a spill, God forbid, Mr. Speaker, it takes upwards of a year for the Gulf of St. Lawrence to empty, for water to cycle around, and if there is an oil spill, it will be absolutely devastating to Quebec, to New Brunswick, to the Ile de Madeline, to Prince Edward Island, to Nova Scotia, to Newfoundland, and of course to the waters that flow into and out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So it's important that we pay attention to how we're moving forward and ensure that all of our legislation, all of our laws are properly constructed to cover any potential problems that may exist. Because, you know, here's a situation where, you know, laws are just now catching up with a disaster that happened 30 years ago, where 84 people lost their lives, Mr. Speaker. We've got to be able to respond quicker. We've got to be able to make sure that we can either look forward, learn from what's happening in other jurisdictions. Let's not wait until the worst case scenario actually presents itself. Let's bring legislation forward to prevent the kinds of disasters that we've talked about happening in the past and happening in other jurisdictions. So that's you know, that's why it is that we need to move forward. We need to work closely with the provinces. In this case, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia. The province on another offshore-related issue, Mr. Speaker, the province of Nova Scotia has extended a moratorium against development, oil and natural gas development, in Georges Bank. That's an area that's been determined to be extraordinarily vulnerable, very sensitive ecosystem, very much a nursery for the fishery throughout the East Coast, and it's been determined in the past by both the federal and provincial governments working together that we needed to prevent any industrial development in that area of the ocean. Well, the province of Nova Scotia has passed legislation to make sure that that won't happen, but the federal government this time has failed to work with the province of Nova Scotia to see that happen. That's a question that we're going to continue to push the government on. The moratorium must be extended, Mr. Speaker, in order to protect the industry that now exists in the fishery, and to protect the ecosystem, to protect our oceans, and to protect our environment throughout the East Coast. But again, that's another part of the legislative framework that needs to be put in place to ensure that as developments continue to move forward, that we have the protections in place to ensure that the damage is not done to what already exists or what might exist well into the future. So I say both BP and Shell Oil are set to conduct new deepwater oil exploration off of Nova Scotia for the first time since 2005. We believe that our workers deserve nothing less than to feel safe, not only in their workplaces, but in the case of the offshore industry, in transit to the workplace as well. I hope this government will continue to work with the provinces involved to make sure that offshore safety regulations are strengthened and that we can avoid the offshore tragedies like Cougar Flight 91, the BP Gulf spill, and of course the Ocean Ranger disaster. Mr. Speaker, I see my time is up. It's been a pleasure to participate in this debate. I look forward to any questions.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I listened with great interest to my honourable colleague and his understanding of the issue, particularly coming from the Maritimes, where so many people are involved in the offshore industry. Certainly where I live in Northern Ontario, we have people who are on flying crews, isolated communities. They're away from home for a long time. But when we look at the offshore industry in particular, we've seen that there have been a number of disturbing accidents and problems in the past. Certainly the whole country still remembers the Ocean Ranger and what happened there, and the lack of safety protocols that left so many men exposed and damaged so many families from that disaster. We see the loss of some of the helicopter that went down recently off Newfoundland. Same questions, same issues of safety. We see the issues now across the country with various pipeline proposals where pipelines have blown out because there have not been the proper safety systems in place, either the loss of life or heavy, heavy damage to the environment. So given the sensitivities in the maritime culture in terms of fisheries, in terms of the habitat, in terms of the danger of people being out on the ocean, I'd like to ask my honourable colleague what he thinks specifically we need to do in terms of the issues of safety and making sure that there are clear rules in place.
The honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. The issues around health and safety in the workplace and otherwise are very important to that member, and he does great work in his constituency on behalf of working people. He's right. In the maritime environment, safety is a big deal. You know, fishing is one of the most dangerous businesses that there is. You know, back in the spring, in the late winter, 5 fishermen, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia died when their vessel went down in a storm off of the southwest, off of the Liverpool in that area. They were out fishing. Halibut. It's a very, very dangerous industry. I think we need to do more, and I've talked with my friends and people within the industry about what it is that we can do to make sure that the people that toil in that industry are safer. It's a collaboration that needs to happen. Mr. Speaker, government, I would suggest, needs to take some leadership on this issue to make sure that there are rules and to make sure that they are enforced. You know, it's all well and good if we can establish the greatest rules, workplace rules, but if we don't enforce them, if we don't hold people accountable, then they're not going to end up doing their job. And so we've only gone part way. And that's why, in this case, we had hoped that the government would also move forward with an independent regulator, Mr. Speaker, that people could deal with, could speak to, and that would help implement good safety and health laws on the offshore.
Question et commentaire.
Questions and comments.
Honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his speech and the points that he raises. I'm on the heels of the member for Timmins, James Bay, who asked a question, and he actually represents my hometown, and so he knows full well, you know, how I grew up, how he grew up with. You felt the earth tremor, and you looked at the clock to see who was on shift, because it might have been your dad or your uncle, your brother who was working in the mines. And so we know full well the safety, that we need safety in the workplace. For my colleague from Dartmouth Cole Harbour, he, I'm sure, remembers in 1999 when Sean Hatcher died. He was crushed by a door on the Nordic Apollo. And I'm sure my colleague remembers this because he was actually provincial leader at that time. And there were no charges laid. There were no charges laid. And I look to where we need to go here, and we do need an independent safety agency. And our colleague in Newfoundland, Lana Payne, she's the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, she actually says point blank that while this bill is a positive step forward, we need an independent safety agency. We need to be able to actually have a body that oversees what's going on when it comes to the safety of our workers on the offshore. So I asked my colleague from Dartmouth Cole Harbour, that's not in this bill. So what's the problem? What's the holdup here? Why is it that the federal government will not move forward on actually creating an independent safety agency?
The honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Thank you. Thanks to my colleague from Halifax across the way for that question. Yeah, I do remember. I do remember that tragic incident in '99, and that tragedy. And as she said, the fact that that no one was charged. I was there in the legislature in 1992 when Westray, when 26 miners died as a result of the explosion underground. And I was a Labour critic in the part of the NDP caucus in those days. And I sat down days, literally hours after that disaster with families in Stellarton and heard the stories and felt the grief. And I sat through days, weeks, months, years of investigations, of reviews, of debate, and we never did, as far as I was concerned, get the legislation that we required to properly hold officials accountable for enforcing health and safety laws. You know, there's the 3 R's in terms of responsibility that both the employer and the employees have to have, but we were never able to hold the proper authorities accountable in that case. The same thing in the case of the Nordic Apollo. And we've certainly always said that government should have a dedicated prosecutor for health and safety, and that we need to make sure that the legislation holds people accountable so that they will be charged. There was the Westray bill that passed here. Dealt with corporate responsibility that was sponsored by my friend and colleague, former leader of the NDP here in this House, Alexa McDonough, and that's a start, Mr. Speaker. But there still has not been anybody charged under that legislation. It takes commitment by government to make sure that people are going to be held accountable.
Question et commentaire.
Questions and comments.
La députée d'Acadie-Bathurst.
The member for Acadie-Bathurst. Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech, my colleague from Dartmouth. My colleague and myself were at the Brunswick mine in '76, and in '76, 6 people were killed within the space of 18 months, and that's where the right to refusal legislation was introduced. I remember the Westray bill, and my colleague, as was said earlier, helped the people, the family of the miners who had been killed, the family, the spouses. And in Bill C-4, we can see that the government wants to change the definition of dangerous work because it doesn't want too many people to be able to refuse dangerous work. So as Parliament, do we really want to pass legislation that will not hold accountable people responsible for such events? It is therefore irresponsible for this government to pass legislation which will encourage companies to force their employees to engage in dangerous practices, as what happened at the Brunswick mine and at Westray as well. In fact, we are stepping back with the Conservative government. Does my colleague agree with me?
Cole Harbour, you have about 40 seconds.
Thank you. My colleague is absolutely right, and I raised that in my speech, my concern that the changes to the definitions in Bill C-4 will, in fact, weaken the rights that have been provided to offshore workers the right to refuse, the right to work safely, and that's a concern, Mr. Speaker. That, as he said, we need to make sure that people are held accountable, that we have safe and healthy workplaces. That's what this legislation is all about. To make sure that we never have an Ocean Ranger again, to make sure we never have a Cougar 91 again in the offshore, to make sure we never have a disaster the scale of the Horizon disaster in the Gulf.